Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5 Cranbrook tour. I am your curator, Kevin Adkisson, with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today we are taking a closer look at the world-renowned Cranbrook Canon. Those of you who have been around Cranbrook for a long time may remember that the Canon was here outside of the women's dorm, or dorm 2, for many decades. It was tragically hit by a lawnmower in 2016 and collapsed one of its iron wheels. And so it only was just reinstalled yesterday morning through a collaborative effort of Cranbrook Art Museum, the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, and Cranbrook Facilities. So why in the world does Cranbrook have a canon? What is its story, and what did it take to make it and to get it back in place? If you aren't familiar with the canon and where it has lived for half a century, we're just right outside of the Art Museum, and you can see the Art Museum and the Orpheus Fountain down there. Now, many of Cranbrook's sculptures date to the 1920s and 30s and 40s, but the canon is a piece that dates a little bit later. It was created between 1966 and 1971 by then head and instructor in sculpture Julius Schmidt. And Julius Schmidt is known as the grandfather of American iron sculpture. He was from Stamford, Connecticut. He lived between 1923 and 2017, and he served for about a decade as an aerial gunner in the U.S. Navy, and he did that after he had studied at the Oklahoma A&M College. And Julius Schmidt studied chemistry, geology, and metallurgy back as an undergraduate. After his time in the U.S. Navy as a gunner, he decided to come to Cranbrook in 1951. Now, that's a pretty significant date in the story of Cranbrook sculpture, because 1951 is the year that Carl Millis left Cranbrook. Now, Julius Schmidt stayed at Cranbrook for 4 years as a student. He earned his BFA and his MFA in sculpture. So one of the few, the proud, the unusual students to actually hold a bachelor's degree from Cranbrook Academy of Art. Now, he went off after his second graduation from Cranbrook in 1955 to study with Ossip Zadkine in Paris, who is a Cubist sculptor who was really influential in the sort of Paris art scene of the 1920s. And Julius Schmidt was with him in the 1950s and early 60s. Then he studied at the Florence Academy. He came back to replace his own mentor, Tex Schiewitz, and Julius Schmidt became the artist in residence for the sculpture department in 1964. Now, he would stay at Cranbrook for the next 6 years, and though he was head of the sculpture department, he worked primarily in one medium, and that was iron. Iron is not a sort of artistic medium that is particularly well popular among artists, particularly in the mid-century moment, when a lot of artists and sculptors had sort of lost the ability to work in the medium that the finished product was. So think of Carl Millis. He was not a bronze caster. He worked in plaster, and then he sent his plasters off to Europe to be cast in bronze. Julius Schmidt wanted to do it really differently. He wanted to be an iron sculptor and to actually cast the iron himself, and that is what he did. For Julius Schmidt, it was a connection between the material of iron with the sort of tactile expression, the touch of the sculpture, and the understanding of how iron was cast would lead to better imagination and therefore a better sort of artistic achievement. Now, what that actually meant in reality was that if he was going to be the head of the Cranbrook Sculpture Department, he needed to have a forge on campus. Up to that point, Cranbrook had never had the opportunity, the chance for its students to cast bronze and iron on campus. And so Julius Schmidt went around through the different tool and die companies that were associated with the auto industry in Detroit, and he got them to donate both money and tools for the first Cranbrook Forge. And so in 1964, he opened the Cranbrook Forge. It was the first building built for the Academy of Art since Eliel Saarinen had died in 1950. And it was a place where students and the instructor could cast up to 1,000-pound sculptures in 6 furnaces, and then they had all the sort of up-to-date equipment needed to make something like a cast iron and bronze cannon here on campus. So the cannon itself debuted at graduation in 1966. It then was sitting in a wooden carriage. The very earliest photos that we have of the cannon after it actually left the sculpture forge was the cannon sitting sort of right here along the pathway between the Orpheus Fountain and the museum. And in those early 1966 photos, it's really just the cannon body sitting in a wooden carriage. And then over the next few years, Schmidt and his students would create the cast iron cannon wheels and then the cast bronze field carriage, this piece here with the tail on the ground, trail on the ground, going up to the cannon support. So what makes our cannon unique from, say, a cannon that you're going to find at Fort Mackinac is that it is a work of sculpture, and it shows Julius Schmidt's love of texture and of sort of having different figures almost seeming to crawl out of the ironwork. It is signed by some of the people who worked on it, including Doc Green, who worked on the piece in 1970. I assume that means that he was working on the wheels and the carriage construction. Alfred Green was a 1968 graduate, so he was one of Julius Schmidt's students who worked here, and he would go on to a long career teaching at the University of at Texas Women's College as an art instructor. Now, the piece is, perhaps ironically, dedicated to Zoltan Szepesi, and I say perhaps ironically because my own research and archives don't exactly spell out a wonderful relationship between Julius Schmidt and any Cranbrook leader, including our president Zoltan Szepesi. And I'll talk a little bit later about Julius Schmidt's relationship with Szepesi's successor, Glenn Paulson, in a moment. Now, I love this area around the muzzle of the cannon, where we really see, I think, the influence of Osip Zadkine, the Paris, the Russian Cubist sculptor working in Paris, who Schmidt had studied with, because there is this sort of Cubist construction to the cannon around the muzzle. It also reminds me of the work of a fellow Cranbrook student, Paul Evans, though Evans was here a little bit before Julius Schmidt was here. Actually, I think they would have overlapped as students. Now, quite unique for a cannon, the lips of the cannon, which is an official cannon term. I spent some of my afternoon on the National Park Service Guide to Historic Cannon Terms website. So the lip of the cannon is usually a round lip, not as often seen as a actual lip and mouth. And this nose here is said to be the nose of Zoltan Szepesi, who was pretty known for his quite large nose and his quite large character, being quite a large character in the life of the Academy. Now, other than the nose and mouth around the muzzle, when we get back to the breech of the cannon, the back end of the cannon, we're seeing again this sort of mixture of abstract sculptures, but then also sort of bodies that are coming out. Here we see a derriere, and then the torso of a woman right behind it, sort of writhing in and out of the cast iron. Behind that is a little sort of crest that says Blam 1966. And one of the projects that Leslie Mayo, the Associate Registrar for the Center, and I are working on is identifying all of these different characters, and particularly the names, because Julius Schmidt did not build this canon on his own. He used his students, and so we want to make sure that our records reflect as many of the students who worked on this project as possible. Now, this piece is actually cast bronze, which is pretty unusual, and it is not a great combination as far as art preservation goes, to have a combination of bronze and cast iron. But this bronze figure of a woman who's sort of screaming and covering her ears is covering over the vent of the cannon. And so this little hole back here is where you would actually have the fuse come out of the cannon to light the gunpowder inside and actually fire the cannon. And so she is sort of this clacker that, in my research, I couldn't actually figure out if this is a traditional element of the cannon. It seemed like instead what you would usually have is just the fuse hole and a feeder stick there, but it does have a nice sort of satisfying clang about it. And then at the very back of the breech, the rear end of the cannon, is the Casabel knob, which is sort of carved, or the iron is sculpted into these wonderful flames that are coming off the back of the Casabel knob. Now, those of you who might be fans of military history or artillery history will recognize this as being a muzzle-loading cannon, and it has in fact been fired multiple times. I think there are stories of it being fired more times than it probably has actually been fired. I have photographic evidence of the cannon being fired out of the sculpture department, so they opened the windows and fired a cannon across the Triton pools into the woods. And then we also know that it was fired in 1993 at the start of the Gulf War. And it was fired again into a tank of pig blood, representing the sort of oil motivation of the Gulf War conflict. And the tank of pig blood was actually sitting on top of an old 1950s Detroit-made classic car. And so the cannon sort of fired across, exploded the pig blood in the oil tank, and then covered the car in blood. And very dramatic piece of performance art that, if you know more details of that story, I would love to have them, because I don't really have a very solid record of that happening. It's more of a sort of oral tradition that it was fired. Now, as the cannon originally sat, it was resting on its bores, these cast iron arms, which are cast into the body of the cannon, and then it sat, as I mentioned, in a wooden carriage. Now it rests on this pretty fabulous bronze carriage, and if I tilt the cannon up, I have removed the elevating screw, so the cannon is fully movable at the moment. We can see here 1970, 1971, when this was cast in bronze. And I love what the cannon comes down on, which is this sort of cracked skull with a pipe coming out of it. And then behind it is the figure of the Foundry queen, who has this snake sort of wrapping around on her breast, and then this harness and chain. And we see more student names carved in. So it says here, Floyd was here. The other side says Mel. And again, Leslie and I are doing some research to figure out who these students would be. Now, I love right underneath the bore of the cannon is this little sentence that says, taste, grace, and elegance, which I assume is a sort of ironic declaration of the item. Who knows, maybe it's not ironic, but I do think the cannon does have a very unique sense of taste, grace, and elegance. Or, because there's no commas, we can really taste the grace and elegance. I mean, cast iron does have a very distinct flavor to it, though I don't recommend that you lick any of my artworks. I will resist. There are some bats and things that are going around. It really is just crawling with different figures. And when we get to the wheels, which are really quite different, both of the two wheels are different in design and style. We come down and there's sort of these Ben-Hur like spikes coming off, and then almost a sort of snake skin. There's this rather terrifying figure of a baby sort of floating across the wheel. and then this sort of palmetto, palm tree. I love the arrow that's sort of going with the rotation of the wheel that says zap in one direction. And then very curiously, because there's nothing else on the Canon quite like this, there's this scroll that features, they almost look like Egyptian hieroglyphs. And if I move the camera closer, we can see that these hieroglyphics are actually showing a cannon being fired. And so you have these bird figures with the bird heads, the body of humans, and they're sort of interacting with a cannon. And then on the other side, you have the sort of cat head and human body figures who are actually loading the cannon using the rammer and the system of actually how you load a front muzzle loaded cannon. And then as you move around, there's all just different sort of creatures. So there's this sort of running man here. I think when Leslie and I get serious about creating our documentation, it makes me think of a common assignment that you get in architecture school, which is to go out to a building or a piece of ornament or other design, and you directed to sketch it. And it doesn't always have to be iconographic. At Falling Water at summer camp, and when I was 15, we had to sketch the stone walls. But there's a sort of process that you get when you take what your eye sees and then run it through your hand and a pencil onto paper, and you begin to observe more and more about the item. So perhaps I'll do another Live at 5 after Leslie and I have sketched the whole thing, because I think actually tracing some of these figures and drawing them, we're going to notice even more that Julius Schmidt and his students put into the object. There's just so much here, and it's pretty hard to see, especially because we can't roll the cannon anymore. Its axle has seized, and so we're having to sort of study it in this one position. Now, I said the two wheels were different, and they really are pretty radically different. You can see that this side has a much more sort of solid texture. It also has some pieces that begin to look, to my eye, almost like auto parts, sort of pistons and engine parts coming around. And then I love this sort of moment of hyper-awareness, but also broken functionality, because it says spoke on it, but you'll notice the one spoke that doesn't actually connect the wheel at all is the one that says spoke. I'm a spoke. I'm here. And then again, there's all sorts of faces that are just sort of popping out. It's probably hard to see that in shadow. Now, we looked at the front of the carriage, but let's go to the trail of the carriage. And I will say that if you come out and study the cannon, I will have it fully secured so that it can't move up and down. We can't aim the cannon. We don't want any guests or children to be hurt by the rocking of the cannon. So it is temporarily being secured by a rope system, but we'll soon be adding in an elevating screw, which is a historic part of the cannon. Ours is a little bit broken, but this elevating screw will be reaffixed to the body of the cast iron cannon so that it is in a locked position. Now, I love this detail. We'll come back to the signature of Julius Schmidt. That's perhaps how I'll conclude our little tour of the cannon. And then here we are seeing another human figure who is sort of reclining back in what appears to me like a basketball uniform. And then out of this gentleman's head, we can see that he is sort of either eating an octopus, or I think there's supposed to be flames coming out, and then out of the flames comes a hand giving a middle finger, and then it goes on and sort of different various parental advisory, be warned, subject matters as we move up the cannon. It is certainly a time capsule of its moment, and it's a time capsule of the moment in American art and sculpture. That this is a cast iron work of sculpture is pretty unusual, but it's also a time capsule in the sort of angst and the real sort of drama and inhumanity of the piece. This is sculpted between 1966 and 1971, so it's the height of the Vietnam era. It was really Cranbrook's only major moment of any great protest. And in particular, Julius Schmidt is the instigator of Cranbrook's greatest moment of protest. So for whatever reason, his position changed in 1968 from artist in residence, from sculptor in residence, which is the most senior level of artist at Cranbrook, to instructor in sculpture. I was trying in archives to figure out why that shift was made in 68. I couldn't get a clear answer, so I'll get back to you on that one. But in 1970, Julius Schmidt his contract was not renewed, and still to this day, the artists in residence at Cranbrook, they have 1 or 3 year contracts. And Glenn Paulson, who was an architect and president of Cranbrook, decided not to renew Julius Schmidt's contract. There were a multitude of forces as to why that was happening, and one of the biggest ones was that he was head of sculpture and all he did was ironwork. And there were a lot of sculpture students who were feeling rather abandoned, that they wanted to do anything that wasn't giant cast iron, sort of the hubris of the male sculptor in a foundry. And Julius Schmidt just wasn't interested. And apparently it was so toxic that if you sort of said you didn't want to do ironwork, he just would say, okay, well, you're not one of my students, even though you were paying tuition to be one of his students. So the archive, we can only see one side of the story. So if you have other thoughts on this matter, if you were there, if you have other documents, we'd love to add them, because it's really hard to piece together what was essentially a anti-administration revolution led by some students, and then an anti-individual artist revolution led by other students, all of which exploded out into the front page of the Detroit News with a series of rather heated op-eds that sort of claimed, oh, Cranbrook is dead, sculpture is dead, Julius Schmidt is horrible, Glenn Paulson is horrible. It really was not a great winter in 1973, or 1970. It was February of 1970 that all this was happening. But I love the sort of conviction of Julius Schmidt when he signs the trail here, and he says, Julius Schmidt is Cranbrook. And because this piece has 1971 on the front of it, I believe that this was actually cast after his contract was not renewed. Now, Julius Schmidt always said he was fired. You actually can't be fired because the contract isn't guaranteed to be renewed. So I will resist saying that Julius Schmidt was fired. But I'm pretty sure that he has carved into this work, Julius Schmidt is Cranbrook, after he was no longer contractually connected to Cranbrook. And that leads to one of the most dramatic instances of the Cranbrook canon being used. So Julius Schmidt and some of his very loyal students, because those who were loyal to Schmidt were extraordinarily loyal to him, took the canon, and though it does not actually have a limber, which is the piece that connects it to a horse that actually moves it in the battlefield, you can sort of pick up the trail and just walk the canon down the street. And so what the students and Julius Schmidt did was they began rolling the canon, and they just took it straight down Academy Way, and they just rolled it down to the staff meeting that was then occurring in the middle of Saarinen House, so about where that jogger is. They then turned the canon towards the front door of Saarinen House. Allegedly, depending on who tells the story, they then add in the gunpowder and then the wadding, and they attempt to fire it through the front door of Saarinen House. That's one version of the story that I've heard. I hope that the more likely version of the story is that they just knocked on the door of Glenn Paulson's house, Saarinen House, and they said, F you, essentially. And he was staring down literally the barrel of a gun as these students and a sculpture instructor were very distressed over the lack of the renewal of his contract. Now, Glenn Paulson very shortly after that had a heart attack from the stress of the sort of student and faculty uprising. It would end up leading to his resignation as president. in the end, Julius Schmidt and other characters involved were not given their contract, and Schmidt does depart Cranbrook in the winter of 1970, never to return as instructor. Glenn Paulson stays on as head of the architecture department until 1971. Now, that is a very dramatic use of the canon. Julius Schmidt went on to have a long career teaching down south somewhere, or the University of Iowa, until he retired in 1993. And so he did go on to have a career, again, mostly working in cast iron. Now, the cannon was out here on display. I mentioned the 2 times that it was fired, and perhaps the 1 time it was attempted to be fired at the president of Cranbrook. Don't recommend that. And then it was really resting here on a similar pedestal, but the concrete base was a little too small. And so 1 week before I got here to Cranbrook, on August 8th of 2016, the cannon carriage did finally collapse and it had to be removed. And it was really just one too many hits of a lawnmower because the sculpture base was too small. And so you can see here the repair of the wheel that had to be recently repaired so that the cannon could come back onto this brand new concrete base that I helped to design so that it would never again be hit by the lawnmower. Now, that damage was repaired by DefFab Design, Definitive Fabrication Design, which is a studio down in Detroit led by Scott Barrels. And Scott was recommended to us from Cranbrook's conservator Kenneth Katz. Art Conservation, also in Detroit. Now, Scott Barrels is not a Cranbrook alum. He has his Bachelor of Fine Arts from Wayne State, but Scott works in iron. And still, even today in 2021, iron is not really a terribly common material for an artist to work in. And so it was really a very specialized project for us to repair the cannon wheels. And we're grateful to Scott Barrels for doing that work. Now, that work was paid for and done by the Cranbrook Art Museum as part of the opening of the landmark exhibition With Eyes Opened. That show opens this Friday, June 18th. It includes over 275 works of art by 250 Cranbrook alumni. This show is going to be spectacular. It's open until September of 2021. There's also an accompanying 600-page plus book, also entitled With Eyes Opened, that comes from something that Eliel Saarinen said about how will this new art school work, and it will work with artists with eyes opened. And so make sure that if you can come to Bloomfield Hills, you come before September to see what is truly a spectacular new show. The cannon, again, which was restored by the Art Museum with assistance and installation assistance by the Cranbrook Center, is part of having it back on campus this week is really important as we celebrate all of the many alumni like Julius Schmidt who have come out of Cranbrook Academy of Art and whose work is now on display in the Art Museum in this stunning tour de force of an exhibit. If you have not already bought the catalog of With Eyes Opened, the book that really tells the most comprehensive history of Cranbrook yet, though of course no history is fully complete, it's a much better start than anything we had, go ahead and order that from Cranbrook Art Museum because it is selling out fast and you will want this not just as a doorstop but as a really impressive piece of scholarship. It was written by Andrew Blauvelt, the director of Cranbrook Art Museum, with essays from his staff, past and present, as well as staff of the Center and Cranbrook Archives. Now, I walked down away from our canon, the subject matter, just because I thought you might be interested in seeing where the canon was made. This is the foundry that Zoltan Zepeshy and Julius Schmidt collaborated on having the auto industry and the tool and die industry donate to Cranbrook in 1964. It had 6 furnaces casting up to 1,000 pounds of bronze and iron. It had electric hoist and bridge cranes, grinders and ovens, muellers and welding tools. It was a little bit of everything. And the photograph that I have that shows the cannon actually being fired, the cannon is sitting sort of where those more modern iron or steel doors are. The cannon was inside of the bronze foundry. These gates were open. There used to be stairs here, and we have a picture of a cannonball, just this burst of light coming out. So the cannon was not only made right here, but it was also first fired here. Now, as I was doing my research into the artillery, Cranbrook's not the only piece of artillery in our collection, but certainly the only piece of artillery that is a sculpture in our collection, I was interested in, what are cannons usually made of? And they usually are made of either bronze or iron. And bronze was a little bit... you could be more precise with a bronze cannon, but they didn't last as long and they were heavier and more expensive. The problem with an iron cannon, even though they were cheaper, easier to move, bronze cannons would sort of, there were telltale signs that let you know when a bronze cannon was wearing out. Apparently an iron cannon lets you know it wears out when you go to light the fuse and the whole thing explodes. So in my fantasy of firing again the Cranbrook cannon, I'm not sure how you know when an iron cannon has given out, but I really don't want to explode any work of art on Cranbrook's campus. And so, best of my knowledge, we will not be firing the Julius Schmidt cannon anytime soon. Those of you who may be wondering, does it still roll? It actually doesn't. One of the curses of iron is that iron, of course, is a ferrous metal and is going to rust. And so the cannon axles and wheels have fully rusted, fully seized, and that became one of the big difficulties of reinstalling it, was that we had to reinstall it exactly as it was frozen before it got hit by the lawnmower, and so we were not able to sort of turn the wheels to adjust the cannon whatsoever. Now, if you head over to our Facebook stories, you'll see some photos of the reinstallation, and on Friday, we'll be posting a blog that's all about the reinstallation. But just a little bit so you can imagine how we actually assembled the 3 parts of the cannon, the wheels, the trail, and then the cannon itself. We used an excavator, like the big backhoe, and we used the bucket of the excavator, tie it to straps, and we lifted each individual piece off of a trailer that brought it here from the art museum storage and from the tower garage, the center storage, and we used the backhoe and straps to slowly lift these pieces together. I have never been more nervous for my toes than in that moment. But successfully using Steve, the mechanic from the Cranbrook garage, as well as other facilities team members, Corey Gross, the registrar at the Art Museum, John Geiger, the preparator at the museum, and Leslie and I from the center, we were able to get the cannon reinstalled. As always, if you have questions, you can comment below. Before we wrap up, I want to invite you to one other thing. Remember, the With Eyes Open, the History of Cranbrook Academy of Art opens on Friday, and go ahead and get that book now. And then on Tuesday, we'll be having a lecture from a scholar coming to us live from India. He's a PhD student at the University of Michigan, and he is researching one of our noted alumna, Nellie Sethna. And Nellie Sethna came to Cranbrook in 1958 as a weaving student and had a long career as a designer in India. And so that talk is going to be at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. You definitely want to look forward to joining me, Vishal, Deborah Rice, the head archivist, as well as a special appearance by Gerhard Nodell, President or Director Emeritus of Cranbrook Academy of Art and head of the Fiber Department. And Gerhard had a relationship with Nellie. Gerhard and Nellie visited each other in America and in India. It's going to be a wonderful talk, an exploration of Cranbrook's connection to Indian mid-century modern design. And again, that will be Tuesday at 1 p.m. and you can get your tickets at center.cranbrook.edu. I hope you enjoyed this Live at 5, looking at the Cranbrook cannon. If you're on campus, come over, try and decipher it. Don't put your hand down the barrel of the gun, and don't lick the gun. And if you have comments on Live at 5 being landscape or portrait mode, let me know. I did Sunday's tour in portrait mode and I got a lot of positive feedback. So who knows which one it works better. It's a bold, brave new world, some 150 Live at 5s in to change the camera orientation. But I appreciate all of you, my followers, for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this look at one of Cranbrook's most unique artifacts and one that we are very excited and proud to have back on display here on campus. And if you are lawn mowing around anything of value, please be careful. Thanks so much, everyone. See you next Wednesday for another Live at 5.